Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Bretton Woods Committee's 2021 annual meeting. We're very fortunate to be joined by World Bank President David Malpass today. And I know President Malpass's time is in high demand during this week of World Bank and IMF spring meetings. So we very much appreciate you taking the time, President Malpass, to be with us today and to address our membership. I don't want to keep you waiting for long, so I'm just going to offer a few quick comments. First is that we kicked off our annual meeting this morning and a session where we launched our new sovereign debt working group. And the working group released their introductory report titled Sovereign Debt, a Critical Challenge. During this morning's session that was chaired by Mr. Bill Rhodes here, who's going to moderate our session today, the working group outlined its work plan for the next year or two and the 4 critical areas that the working group is going to address in their future efforts. These 4 areas are enhancing debt transparency, promoting equitable burden sharing among all creditors, achieving full and constructive private sector participation, and exploring the prospects for state contingent financing. So I know President Malpass has views on many of these issues, and we will be hearing from him today on several of these topics, and how the World Bank is helping developing countries address unsustainable debt loads. Additionally, President Malpass will share more about what the World Bank is doing to address inequality, to ensure vaccine access, and to address climate challenges as well, as developing countries and the rest of the world works to achieve an equitable COVID recovery. We'll reserve some time at the end for audience questions. So if you do have a question, please submit them by typing it into the Q&A pane at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar, or by submitting them through the chat function. We'll collect these throughout, and then we'll go to individuals towards the end to pose their questions. I also want to thank our annual meeting sponsors, SICPA Holdings, Morgan Stanley, and Standard Chartered. Without their generous contributions, the annual meeting would not be possible, so I thank them for their support. And so finally, let me introduce our speakers, and then I'll turn it over to them. First, our featured guest, who really needs no introduction. President David Malpass is the 13th president of the World Bank Group and has served in this capacity since 2019. He previously served as Undersecretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Treasury and has had several positions at Treasury throughout his career. He's also had a long distinguished career in the private sector, including as chief economist of Bear Stearns, and was a founder of his own macroeconomics firm. So thank you again, President Malpass, for joining us today. And I'd also like to introduce our moderator, Bill Rhodes, who serves on the Bretton Woods Committee's board of directors and our executive committee. As I mentioned, he is co-chairing our new Sovereign Debt Working Group initiative, and we couldn't have asked for someone better to lead that effort for us. Many of you know that Bill had a long and distinguished career at Citibank, and following his retirement from Citi, and I use that term very loosely, Bill, he founded and is currently the CEO and president of William R. Rhodes Global Advisors. So thanks again, Bill, for your critical leadership, and I'll turn it over to you to get our conversation started.
Thank you, Emily, and thank all of you who are joining us today and all the supporters of Bretton Woods. It's always a great pleasure to introduce my friend David Malpass. And actually, David, it's the 3rd time that we've had a chance to interview you since you took the job as head of the World Bank almost 2 years ago. And of course, you and I worked very closely together over the years when you were at various posts in the U.S. Treasury and then again at the New York Economic Club. So we have a long history here together. I have a few opening comments I'd like to put to you and then turn it over to you, and then you will give your thoughts, and then we can do an interchange. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately impacted the economies of the emerging markets and the poorer countries. And at the same time that we've seen this, we've seen massive fiscal and monetary stimulus by the major central banks and treasuries of the so-called developed countries led by the United States. And this, of course, comes along with their ability to access vaccines, the industrialized countries, more rapidly than the poor or emerging market economies. And the projections that you're putting out, David, and the IMF show a rapid recovery in some of these countries like the United States, China, and some of the European countries this year, but not particularly for the emerging market countries. And one of the things that you have taken a leadership role on is your plan you've rolled out to help on vaccines and also to support many of these poorer countries in battling not only the COVID pandemic, but also the tremendous, impact it's had on their economies. And I think that this is such a worthy effort that the World Bank's engaged in. As a matter of fact, I think that since the founding at Bretton Woods of the World Bank, you are facing the biggest challenge the World Bank has ever faced with the poorer countries, with the number of people going into poverty, et cetera. So I always like to say you are the right man at the right time in the right spot. One of the things I would hope you would comment on, and you and I have discussed it quite a bit, is the role of China. Because if we go back to our days when you were in the Treasury and we were doing the Latin American debt crisis and the Asian financial crisis, China was not a major creditor nation. And now, according to the Kiel Institute, through their One Belt and One Road initiative, they have something pretty close to $700 billion of funds out to the emerging markets, which makes them the largest creditor nation. And although they've signed on with the framework that you and the IMF have worked out and the G20, it's not clear what adherence they're giving to it. And also on the DSSI, on our last discussion we had at the annual meetings, you were pushing very hard to get that extended for the rest of this year, but it was only extended through June. And so I think the role of China, which I always view as the elephant in the room, on trying to get all of these initiatives that you and the IMF are trying to do in the G20 to help the poorer countries, is going to be key. And I would like your comments on that, because you have followed the role of China as it has become a major creditor nation, and also its role within the World Bank. So having said that, let me turn it over to you, because I think the audience really wants to hear what you have to say, not my particular framing of questions for you. So thank you again, David. I turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Emily. And thank you so much, Bill, for having me, and also for all the work that you've done over these many decades. So, people can think back to the 1980s when there were gigantic, when the debt of developing countries was bigger than the capitalization of the banking system, and there were huge challenges. And you were a strong leader in those years, and the world got through it and then moved on. But we have to look back and say that lost decade that Latin America faced, and it really was 10 rough years for a lot of Latin countries and a lot of other developing countries. That's what we want to avoid this time. So I've been trying to push forward with the urgency of the situation, and also with a knowledge that resources are necessary, but also I think new thinking is often necessary. This morning I spoke with the G24, which is not the G20, but the 24, and talked with them about the importance of the voices of developing countries being in the debate, to talk at the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, and also at the G20 itself. So I think we ought to encourage the variety of international institutions and countries to speak on these issues. COVID has cost a lot of lives, a lot of livelihoods. The output of the world went down. It's an incredible step backward for the most vulnerable. What we did with the World Bank, I'll go through some of our activities, both in terms of delivery. I want to mention climate change. I want to mention COVID. Vaccines. And also debt, and then I'll look forward to the discussion with all of you. What we did beginning a year ago was to try to move as fast as we could with a broad set of programs. So we were able to put in 100 health programs for 100 different countries, more than that actually, very quickly, so that we could provide financing for personal protective equipment and other necessary parts of the COVID response. And then later in the summer, we broadened that and passed the board unanimously in October with broadening that to vaccines, which had not been invented yet, but we expected them to be invented, and we knew that we needed to do an assessment of the capacity of countries to deliver the vaccines. So we're now at the spot where we are optimistic that we'll have 50 country programs in place by mid-year that will use $4 billion, 1/3 of the financing that we have available from our original authorization in October. So the reason that's important is because we need to, as early as possible, start the vaccination efforts for countries, because very few countries anywhere, even including in the US, have the capacity to deliver the vaccines as quickly as the supplies will begin to go up. And so we need to get started as soon as we can in as many countries as we can. So the World Bank was leaning forward as hard as possible into this pandemic over the last year. So our commitments are up. We're up 65% in calendar year 2020. That's the biggest surge that the World Bank has gone through. That's bigger than what occurred in 2009. And the reason that was important, as I mentioned, is we needed to get the breadth of coverage of country programs. IFC and MEGA were able to have elevated levels of delivery, even though there was a global recession underway. So we're up 65%, record levels in both the dollar commitments, that over $70 billion for IBRD and IDA, but also in terms of the percentage increase. So this brings us in calendar year 2020, our approvals exceeded $100 billion for the first time in World Bank history. So I'm happy with both the speed that we were able to achieve, but also the scale and quality of the programs was good. That doesn't mean there's any room for complacency. We need to. I think there will be many years of greater need for the poorest countries in order to make up for the severity of the pandemic, and that means concessional resources. So one of the things we're working hard on, and I very much value Bretton Woods Committee's engagement on the IDA 20 effort. So IDA 19, we were able to front load. It was a 3-year replenishment commitment. We will try to spend that in 2 years, and that means bringing forward by a year the replenishment effort for IDA 20. And so I hope to finish it by December of this year, and that will help a lot in terms of maintaining resources for the poorest countries into 2021 and on beyond, 22 and 23, which I think will be all important in the recovery process. I want to mention that within the World Bank, and I know you're more knowledgeable than almost anyone, we've done 2 things that will help with this effort. One is the realignment that we completed in June last year. I've discussed that with your group, but it puts World Bank staff closer to the client. It means that our footprint will be expanding outside of Washington, but not so much in Washington. In fact, we may have some fewer seats in Washington, more seats abroad in order to bring us closer to clients. And we also have drastically increased our efforts with the FCV countries, the fragile conflict violent countries. And that's going well, but it's been made much more difficult by COVID and work from home. We now have a new managing director of the IFC, Makhtar Diop, who many of you know from his many years at the World Bank and also as finance minister of Senegal. And so that's bringing new energy in IFC. It's working to expand the private sector in countries. I want to focus on climate change, and on debt as well. So on climate change, our action plan, which I announced on Friday, and we'll be working with the international community on discussions and with our executive directors at the board of the IMF, it includes, and so I want to give you a kind of a long list because it's a very ambitious plan. One, there are new targets for climate financing. Two, there's the alignment of our financing flows with the Paris Agreement. Number three, we're collaborating closely with the IMF and others. We've invited other organizations, including the country platforms, to work with us on climate change. Four, we're putting in new diagnostics, which are very important because we have to have better measurement of the progress that we're making and the gaps that still need to be made. Five, we're going to have, in addition to the focus that we've been used to on how much we spend, we want to have equal focus on how much impact we have. What are the results? That means that involves the diagnostics, meaning are we actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and by how much? Which are the most effective ways to do it? And same kind of question on adaptation. Are we saving lives? How are we doing it? What's the best way to do it? So those are some of the questions that we have, but also the focus of our program to have the biggest impact with the dollars that are being spent. We're working with countries on indices. I lost track of my number. Maybe I'm up to number 6 or 7, but an important part of the effort right now is in working with countries to help them do nationally determined contributions that integrate their development plans with their climate plans and are what the countries want to do, and then looking for financing for their various avenues. Also, we are launching country climate and development reports, country climate and development reports, CCDRs, which you'll be hearing a lot more about. We hope to do 25 countries, the biggest emitters and the biggest adaptation vulnerability countries, in order to have a baseline and to integrate that into our country planning process for World Bank resources. Also, we want to do more with capital markets through blue and green bonds. And finally, but last but by far not least, we want to have sectoral transitions. So in many of the sectors, there needs to be specific vertical diagnostics on how do you make a transition for the transport sectors of the world. What are the best ways to do that? One of the keys for this, we want to help countries with what we call a just transition from coal to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy. I wanted to go through those things in detail with you because it's new and because it's ambitious, big plan by the World Bank on climate change. And then the final thing, Bill, that I wanted to do is on the debt challenge. We're working very closely with the IMF. I talked with Kristalina this morning on one of our many meetings, and we speak regularly, and staff speaks regularly with the IMF as we work to support the successful implementation of the G20's common framework for debt sustainability. So we need a lot more progress for the world in terms of debt sustainability and debt transparency. They work hand in hand in order to get the job done. An important part of the goal is to free up resources so that there's more resources for health, education, for food. You know, food prices are rising in many parts of the world, and that's problematic and challenging from a fiscal standpoint, and also climate adaptation. So we're working to have greater transparency and also broader participation in the debt relief efforts. That's been a big challenge for the DSSI that I hope is being extended by the G20 right now. Two things I want to mention that the World Bank is also engaged in. One is called SDFP. You know how we love acronyms. So that's the Sustainable Development Finance Policy, which is part of IDA 19. So we were tasked by the IDA deputies and the governors to make IDA have more transparency in the commitment of resources. So we're working with countries directly on transparency of debt as part of the SDFP effort. And also we have a big effort under our debt reporting system. The World Bank within DEC has a debt reporting system that publishes an annual report called the IDS, the International Debt Statistics, which is the seminal work or the lead work on debt and debt contracts. And so in last October, we were able to really expand the coverage of that report so that, for example, it included central bank swaps, which has been a growing area that was not getting captured in the debt statistics, even though maybe the swaps involved interest rate charges that were being done. So that is now having better coverage. We're still struggling in two areas. One is the non-disclosure clauses that have become commonplace in Bill, you raised China. So two of the things I'll mention related to China is our work to encourage much less use of non-disclosure clauses. Some of the recent clauses burden not only the creditor, that they can't say how much they lent, but the debtor can't say how much they borrowed, and it makes it very difficult to get through the restructuring efforts that we're trying to achieve. And also the collateralization of debt. That's become commonplace for the bigger contracts and is also problematic because it makes it harder to have transparency, and it also means that it's much harder to restructure or to have a change in the price. All of this is in the context of a much lower global interest rate level than before. The rates have been coming down at both the short end and the long end, and yet for a lot of the debt for the poorest countries, the rates haven't been coming down. So this is a big challenge. How do you narrow the inequality if you don't have the same interest rate environment or a competitive interest rate environment for those countries? So I wanted to mention that. Bill, you mentioned also I have raised inequality as a core challenge in vaccines. How do we get fair and equitable coverage? And our World Bank goal within that has been to have as many financing programs. The money can go to COVAX, the money can go to manufacturers. We want to make the money available for the countries and to try to get them early to go into contracts so that they can have delivery schedules coming forward. So that's we're very active in the capacity building and in the vaccine contracting, and that's a way to respond to the inequality. One other core aspect of inequality is the amount of stimulus that's going through the advanced economies dwarfs any of the resources that might be available to the developing countries. So the likelihood is that the gap the developing countries are to an extent being left behind in terms of per capita income as the advanced economies pump money in. I've talked about this in other fora, but we've got the oddity of the central banks of the advanced economies buying assets that are only issued or only available for purchase for people at the high end of the income scale, or they're issued by companies that are bond issuers or governments that are bond issuers. And that means a very narrow top end segment of the global economy being able to get the direct benefit of those asset purchases. So a question for the advanced economies is, do their fiscal and monetary stimulus efforts how long will it take for them to have benefit for the poorer countries? One other core question, and I'll end at this point. On climate change, one of the big issues is the magnitude of the transition needed toward lower carbon energy sources and the cost of that. It's gigantic cost. So can the world help finance global public goods for this segment of the climate change agenda? And if so, how? What are the mechanisms for the mobilization of capital that's needed in this great magnitude. With that, let me go back to Bill and thank you very much to the Bretton Woods Committee for all its involvement and interest in development issues. I think it's a huge benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you very much for all of your doing. You ran through that laundry list, and it's just incredible. As you know, we embarked on this sovereign risk program with your encouragement and also Kristalina's at the IMF. And a number of things that you've mentioned, we are planning to cover over a period of a year, 18 months probably, because we don't want to just do a one and done. We want to take our time in doing it. And so we had the initiation, the first session this morning, but a number of things you mentioned, like on green finance and climate, we talked about, and we hope to get into that. One of the things that we feel is very, very important is a point you touched on, which is transparency and disclosure. Because if you don't have all parties, when you get into a difficult debt situation, being prepared to put on the table what the conditionality is, you can never really take care of the situation. And one of the areas that I think when you take a look at Zambia, it happened in Ecuador, I think it's very important that China take a role in this, because as the largest creditor nation, we definitely need China. One of the other things that I wanted to ask you about was you felt very strongly last time we talked at the annual meetings, and here we are at the spring meetings, about extending the DSSI. And I would ask you, where does that stand now? Because you want to extend it to the end of this year. And unfortunately, they could only extend it to June. So where do you see that going at this particular point?
The G20, I think, will consider a further extension, and I'm cautiously optimistic that they'll extend toward the end of the year, but maybe with the proviso that this is the last one. There is sentiment among some of the G20, many of the G20, that look, deferring the debt payments was useful in the heart of the crisis, but there has to be an end point to it. So I think that makes sense. The savings, to remind people, the DSSI deferred the payments, but at the end of the deferral period, then the interest and the principal comes due, but also the interest on the deferred amounts comes due. So it was really a reprofiling that was being done. I think we need to go further in the common framework that the G20, it's very welcome that the G20 has been engaged in this, including China, and pushing forward with it. It was a step beyond the DSSI, and I think as it is implemented, we're working hard in close collaboration with the IMF on implementing the G20's next step, the common framework, that it will find ways to identify unsustainable debt situations for some countries and find a pathway toward reducing that unsustainability, so that we get to the goal is to have moderate debt levels, or moderate sustainability for countries that will last for beyond the liquidity window of these programs. We need to find a longer term sustainability for the countries so they can attract new investment.
One of the things I want to ask you about is that you have so much on the plate as I listen to it, and I'm so impressed. How are you going to fund yourself? Because the World Bank goes to the markets, and I've never seen a list of let's say, goals before the World Bank that you want to achieve. So I would ask you about the funding side. And then the other area, which I know that you feel strongly about, is working with the private sector, the old A and B loans, and how we can do that. And another area, particularly on the vaccine situation, is if you could comment on how you're working with the regional development banks. I mean, like the Inter-American Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, the Bank for Infrastructure, the China Bank Infrastructure, which is led by a former World Bank official. So maybe if you could comment on some of those things, David.
Okay, happy to. Maybe I'll work backward on that one, Bill. So with regard to vaccines, we're working closely with other MDBs. The Inter-American Development Bank announced that they were going to have a guarantee program and so those are one of the things that we've wanted to do, is to have quite a few different players or possible financiers involved, and then if we work and share among us, whether that's Gavi, that's COVAX, that's of course UNICEF and WHO, we're working all together on a common goal of fair and equitable distribution of the vaccines. With regard to AIIB, I just spoke with Jen last week. He's the president of AIIB, and we co-finance with them in some of the programs that we've already passed. What the World Bank is doing is trying to have a streamlined effort so that not every program has to go individually through the board. We need to, in order to get the volume of programs that are needed for vaccination, we have set up a fast track procedure that will bring many programs to the board in coming weeks and months. Every week now we have multiple sizable programs going through the board. So we're working with the regional banks, and we invite co-financing of our programs, and we look at what they've been able to achieve. As far as the sources of funding for the World Bank, I want to mention several. One is IDA 20 that I already mentioned. So we're in full swing for the next replenishment cycle for IDA. And one thing that people may not be fully aware of, IBRD is one of the biggest funders of IDA. So IBRD, the lending window of the World Bank, as it generates positive net income, a percentage of that goes to IDA, and it's been one of the biggest sources of funding for IDA over the life of IDA. And so we'll continue that. That's an ongoing process. Also, IDA, as you know, now issues bonds. So we've been very pleased with the AAA rating that's been achieved by IDA. One of the challenges we have this year, and we've invited the U.S. SEC has not, and I've forgotten our precise words, that we need to have IDA recognized as an issuer within U.S. capital markets, the way all of the other MDBs are recognized. So, for example, AIIB, an Asian Development Bank, and Inter-American Development Bank can issue debt in U.S. markets, but IDA can't issue registered debt. We do private placements into the U.S. market, and that's been a good source of funding. So we invite Bretton Woods Committee to help us with SEC and with Congress to get registration of IDA bonds. And then I wanted to turn to the primary source of funding. A primary source of funding for the World Bank is in debt markets for IBRD. So in the last, we're at the point where we're raising nearly $100 billion in capital markets over the last 12 months, and that will go somewhat higher as we continue the surge. That's while maintaining a AAA credit rating. So that's a lot of funding. If you put that in context for our climate change action plan, it alone will commit $100 billion more than that, and plus mobilizations over the next 5 years as part of climate change. So we need a lot of bond issuance within the World Bank group. Then we mobilize with the private sector, and that's a critical part of our operation. We can take a look at other forms of fundraising for the bank. So I gave you enough, I hope, for you to think about, Bill. The good news, we completed the general capital increase in 2019, and also there was a large capital increase for IFC, and we completed IDA 19 in December of 2019. So the bank entered the pandemic with recent capital increases. So what we're doing now is trying to look forward carefully over the next 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years. How do we maintain the flow, to the countries because we have a surge going now? It means that we have to we've stretched in order to make the current funding. And so we need to think about new sources of funding going forward to meet the needs of climate change and recovery from the pandemic.
Well, I think your work on providing the vaccines is laudatory. And you remember, I worked in the early years of the Latin American debt crisis on debt for equity, and then we got into debt for health, debt for environment. And I've come up with some thoughts with a experienced epidemiologist, Cristina Valencia, on doing debt for vaccines. And I will send you our thoughts on that. But I think that as far as I'm concerned on vaccines, unless we get the whole world vaccinated within a reasonable period of time, no one's going to be vaccinated, because this thing just keeps mutating with various variants, and we're not going to be able to get back to normality unless we can do that. And I know you really have taken a leadership role on providing funding for vaccines for the poorer countries, the emerging market countries.
Can I add to that? So thank you. Yes, we have a leadership role on the financing and also the programs to distribute the vaccines in countries. So capacity building is a big part of what the bank does. But I want to mention also the need for more information sharing regarding export and supply commitments and requirements. One of the things we've observed, and I keep raising it with people, is that there's been lack of clarity, lack of transparency in terms of the contracts that different intermediaries and the countries and the suppliers have with each other. And it makes it hard then to know where the excess supply is going to be. So we're I think well positioned from the financing standpoint. We have countries who have money and are eager to buy, and we've done the capacity assessment, so they're prepared to begin delivering vaccines to their people immediately if they can get some supply. But it's been hard to know who has excess supply within the system. So I invite people to push along. Some of the advanced economies, I think, will quickly be in a position of excess supply, and I would like to get that released for some of the poorest countries as soon as possible, because, as I mentioned before, the capacity constraint means that even if you had supply, you're only going to be able to deliver it week by week. It's going to take a lot of weeks to fully vaccinate quite a few of these countries. And so the sooner that the initial supplies can be delivered to the countries, the better it's going to be for the long-term viability.
I think that's very correct, what I hear you saying. One of the things you're going to have to watch out for when you get into situations like this is the whole area of corruption. And I know you've done a lot of work in the World Bank following on Jim Wolfenson in this area. But anytime you get a scarce commodity, unfortunately, corruption raises its hands. And the World Bank has always been a leader in trying to fight that, particularly since Jim Wolfenson put that on as a priority.
Exactly right. I'm proud of the work that was done, especially in September and October last year. So we went into the vaccine program area knowing that this is going to be maybe the biggest vaccination system that the world has seen, and that corruption would be one of the challenges. And so as the program reached board approval in October, that was a core part of it. And we've seen it operate. I don't know if you've seen in the news a little bit. In Lebanon, it was one of the first programs, because they were able to change their laws in order to provide the liability shield that was needed by the vaccine manufacturers. And they began taking delivery of vaccines. This is 6 weeks ago or so. So it was early in the cycle. And yet it began to stumble on the lack of fairness in the distribution. And so the World Bank's been outspoken in because we have contract conditions that require the fairness of the system. it gave latitude for the bank to be outspoken in terms of making sure that the country complies with the conditions of the contract. So we'll be doing that in other countries, trying to avoid the corruption or the corruption that's inherent in this kind of valuable contract.
So one of the things I'd like to ask you to do is to sort of take off your World Bank cap and put on your economist cap. And let me ask you if you are concerned about what a lot of people are. Larry Summers came out with this famous op-ed, 6 weeks ago or so in the Washington Post about the concern of inflation. And we're seeing the markets responding to that because, as you mentioned earlier, we've been living in an environment of low interest rates. But as you have all this fiscal and monetary stimulus pumped in by the world's major economies, it's the United States, it's Europe, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England. You're seeing it in China with the People's Bank of China, although they're starting to talk about cutting back, in the Bank of Japan. So you see the major economies of the world pumping in all of this money. And when you take a look at the balance sheet, if you want to use that term, of the Federal Reserve, I mean, before the financial crisis, the Great Recession, the balance sheet was about 800 million. It grew to 800 billion. It grew to area of 4 trillion, and then they started to reduce it. And now people would say it's somewhere between 7 and 8 trillion. So billion, excuse me. And so the question is, in this rise from that we've seen of the balance sheet of the Fed, and also, the various programs put forth, for the stimulus here in the United States, as I said, and elsewhere, are you concerned that we could hit a bump in the road a year, 2 years down the line on inflation, which would then raise interest rates here and in Europe? And that always affects the emerging market countries, because we've all seen this movie before with different subtitles. And every time you have inflation, you see rising interest rates by the central banks, and that really hits big time onto the emerging markets.
Bill, I'm concerned about lots of things, and the minute you say you're not concerned about something, it probably will happen. So I want to be careful on that. But one thing I think is important, I want to talk about 2 aspects of the problem, and these are not so much things that occupy the World Bank, but I am interested in from a global growth standpoint of debt and what the central banks are doing. So I want to, you mentioned the balance sheet pre-2008 of the Fed. When it was $800 billion, the entire liabilities that were in the banking system were called required reserves. And so they were the leverage of the banking system. Nowadays, and starting in 2009, there was this major shift to what I call post-monetarism. And so the reserves are a big chunk of the reserves that are being used to fund the central bank's assets, not only in the U.S. but in Japan, in the ECB, are called excess reserves. And I think there is a very big difference. The Fed pays interest on the excess reserves. So basically, it's borrowing from the banking system in order to buy long duration assets. So while inflation is possible and it should be watched out for and guarded against, I think the bigger challenge from that standpoint is the concentration of wealth and assets in people that sell long duration assets or own long duration assets. It's a very narrow group of the population that benefits from those asset purchases, yet the funding source, this excess reserves that's on the liability side of the central bank's assets, is from it's broad-based. It comes from all of the people of the countries through the banking system to fund that narrowing of long duration assets. I think there would be benefit from shortening the duration of the assets of the central banks. But that gets to the entry point for small businesses, the financing sources for mortgages, for example, that would be more fairly and equitably available to a broad range of the population. I also wanted to mention debt. Since you asked a pretty open-ended question, I am concerned that the amount of debt in the advanced economies means that there's this one-time opportunity where a generation of specific set of years gets to borrow a huge amount. And then even if you assume there's no rise in interest rates, it will have to be rolled over into the future. You only get to do this once in terms of the giant rise in borrowing. So it's kind of a second derivative concern that what it means is that we should be very careful about the investments made with this one-time borrowing that's been available to not only the US, but also to Japan, to Europe, to the advanced economies. The developing countries don't get to do this. They're not running up their debt to GDP ratios, anything like what's going on in the advanced economies. And so it's incumbent on the advanced economies to really make use of the money that's being borrowed nowadays.
But as we know, every time that you see that we see that interest rates rise in the so-called developed world, obviously key is the Fed, and others seem to follow. It really hits the debt service possibilities of the emerging market and the poorer countries, and once that happens, then you have the political security fallout, etc. So I was very interested to hear your thoughts about it, because it's certainly a point that is concerning the markets in general, as you know.
So yes, and this is a challenge for regulatory policy. If you're in a post-monetarist world where the bank reserves are excess reserves, then it puts extra burden on the quality of the regulatory policy. So are you allowing the banking system to own a variety of assets, or is there a bias within that system toward the assets of the biggest companies or the safest companies? And that's going to be, I think, a growth challenge for the future as well.
Well, I couldn't resist asking that, because historically you've always been a Fed watcher in your various roles as chief economist, wherever it may be. So I think, having gone through all of this, I think we have a number of questions, and I don't want to let you go before we give some of the audience a chance for questions. So Emily, I'll turn it over to you.
This was great, Bill. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Thank you, President Malpass. This was a very wide-ranging discussion. We do have a few questions from the audience, and I first want to go to John Negroponte. John, if you would, please go ahead and pose your question.
Hello,
So
John.
thank you very much. Hello, David. Hello, Bill. It's good to see you both. Thank you for the very interesting discussion. I wanted to bring you to a big United States priority at the moment, which, after COVID and reviving our economy, I think the situation at the border and in Central America is an extremely high priority. And I'm wondering, David, whether you envisage ramping up your efforts to assist the Northern Triangle countries in Central America in your future plans.
Thanks, John, and I've known you a long time, and first as U.S. Ambassador to Honduras, and I traveled to Honduras and Guatemala in 1984 as part of the Kissinger Commission review, which was of the development assistance programs in that region. And so we know over a long period of time the challenge of having better economies in the Northern Triangle, and I think that should be a high priority of the world. I've met with the leaders of Central America. We have expanded the World Bank operations there with new personnel, with new relationships with the Inter-American Development Bank. And so I think we're on the right track, but frankly, these are really challenging political environments and economic environments for the countries. So this gets into, and you know the issues better than I, the infrastructure challenges that the people face, the jobs challenging, corruption challenges, and also the pure agriculture and environment and climate challenges that they face. So we are, I think it is well, I know it's a high priority of the World Bank, but it should be a high priority of the world to make this situation work. I'm in regular contact with Mexico, and Mexico is a key player within the Northern Triangle because of its long border. And so we work with Mexico and engage them, and they're engaged. So I think there's a lot of goodwill in various parts of the world to make this situation work. It just takes doggedness, I think, to really make progress.
I just would make a comment on that, and thank you, John, for your question. As John knows, I'm an advocate of some sort of a Marshall Plan for Central America, obviously working with Mexico, and the other bookend is Colombia. And of course, the World Bank on the original Marshall Plan under McCoy had a big role in helping that happen. And I agree completely with your comments, and also with John. It certainly is a priority, and it's a priority of the moment. That's for sure. Emily.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, John, for that question. I'd like to next go to Bianca Taylor. We have a question on climate. Bianca?
Hi, I just had a question. David Malpass had mentioned vulnerability and also the cost of climate mitigation. But on the resiliency side, the vulnerability reports, are those ready, or when would they be ready? And would they be tied? Will there be any financing available for infrastructure on the resiliency side?
Yeah, good question. So what I've announced in part of our climate change action plan is we've launched a new set of reports called Climate Change Development Reports. And so they will feed into our country programs. And so there's not funding as such tied to these climate change CCDRs. It's more of a country-specific diagnostic to look at a country and say, because we're going to look at 25 countries initially, and some of them are major emitters of greenhouse gases. Others are more problematic from an adaptation standpoint or a resilience standpoint. And so there'll be a mix of those. We've invited close collaboration with the IMF and with other MDBs on these, with MDBs on these reports. So I think the goal, working closely with the country and also with their NDCs, the NDCs of the country, the goal is to have a clear plan, a long-term strategy by the country of what it's trying to achieve in conjunction with Paris alignment, and our financing will be Paris aligned, and we will look for concrete ways to help the country either transition or create a new direction that's cleaner and greener for its own development.
Thank you, President Malpass. I think we have time for one last question, and we've had several questions on debt. So I think we'll wrap up with this last question. Carl Ross, would you go ahead and pose your question, please?
Hi, David and Bill. It's nice to see you, especially you, David. Yeah, my question is on debt, and when you think back to the last year, which has been a very crazy year in so many ways, what we've observed is that dozens upon dozens of countries were able to use the capital markets to fund the COVID shock, the fiscal shock that came along with the COVID shock. And, those countries range from, the single A investment grade all the way down to single B. Now, granted, there were very few countries who accessed the markets that were in the, the so-called IDA eligible, or the lower income countries, but there were some. And so I'm wondering, how you reconcile, the calls for, debt restructuring and private sector participation with with this sort of access to capital markets that I think we all, having observed what's happened over the last year, recognize that, countries that had good reputations in the international capital markets were able to use that as a source of financing. And countries with bad reputations, Argentina and Ecuador, among others, were sort of stuck out there. What's your thoughts in that realm and the cost benefits analysis that would be implied there?
Got it. Tough questions. Carl, it's good to see you after it's been 10 years or more. And everyone in the audience, I miss lots of Wall Street friends from, I think I added up 24 years. And so I'm happy to be in the development community and world now, but the questions Carl's raising are vital. One thing I observe is there's this very strong reach for yield going on. And so that's one of the reasons I push so hard on transparency, that it's really useful to have a reach for yield if the contracts can be non-collateralized, and if they can not, I really think the world should try to avoid having these non-disclosure clauses in the contracts and have them be transparent in terms of the interest rates and the maturity of the contracts. That's not the way the world was headed a couple of years ago, and I think it's important that it get back on track. Now, and Carl's point is very relevant as far as this bifurcation of the market into the countries doing better and worse. I was pleased to see Ghana did a zero coupon bond just last week, and yet one of the challenges that I hope the Bretton Woods Committee will opine on this. This goes back 1 decade, 2 decades to what's the appropriate collective action clause within Eurobond contracts, and what is the priority in the capital structure of various creditors. That still is getting resolved or worked on under the common framework. And so I think this poses these kind of core fundamental issues of where is the world system going, in that it's right now pretty heavily balanced in favor of the creditors, who are in a very healthy position of being in a reach for yield environment. So I can't put that all together. I think we're going to have to explore it country by country as far as how do you create and insist on more transparency within the contracts, and then also use this reach for yield period in order to substitute for some of the old contracts that were non-transparent. And that's a good challenge, a big challenge for Ghana, for Cote d'Ivoire, for lots of countries, and even Ecuador that you mentioned, of how do we move forward in a very transparent way that invites lots more capital to flow into the country, because we know it's available. There's a reach for yield that's gigantic compared to the needs of these countries. And so I really want to leave you with the thought that we have a huge opportunity, but we have to move urgently to improve the system so it'll work. Thanks.
Well, it's very interesting that you say that, because one of the areas that we're looking at in our study is exactly collective action clauses, how they can be modified, how they can be updated, and also tied in, David, with transparency. And we share, I think, your concern about the search and reach for yield. And of course, if you take that all together, and hopefully I may be wrong on inflation and rising interest rates, but if you take search for yield and reach for yield, and you combine it with rising interest rates and pushed by inflation, this is going to be even a bigger challenge, I think, for you at the World Bank and the IMF going forward. But I'd like to thank you very much for your support of what we're trying to do, and we're doing everything possible that we can to support your efforts here. And if you get a chance, you have so much on your plate, to read our introductory report, I think you'll be very happy with it in the sense of following up on some of your suggestions, but we would also very much like to have your suggestions after you read it. If you have any further thoughts on what we can do as we roll out this process over the next 18 months.
We did look at it, and I found it very interesting, Bill. So please, and we'll try to give you specific feedback to it. And also, as you're engaged with IIF and with the G20, with the G30, all of these organizations forming or coming to a kind of a consensus on the changes that are possible within the international system that will be beneficial in the long run to both the creditors and debtors, and have a balance among the various creditors in terms of the next steps. I think those are very worthwhile goals. So thank you.
Well, thank you for taking your time. Thank you for the work you're doing. And we count on you to be with us again at the annual meetings, tough as that is for you, but we're there supporting you. And any comments you have on what you think we can do better to help support you, please don't hesitate to let us know. And I'd like to thank all of you in the audience, the questions. And Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you to bring it to a close here. But again, thank you very much, David.
Yep, that's it. I think President Malpass has been very generous with his time. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, President Malpass. This was an incredibly wide-ranging and rich discussion. We look forward to your future comments on our future sovereign debt work. And our annual meeting will continue on Wednesday with a conversation with IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva. So we'll get her thoughts on much of what was discussed today. Hope to see you Wednesday. Thanks again, everyone.